Most of the plants sold in American garden centers this spring require something from you every single season. Dividing, replacing, cutting back at the wrong time, staking, feeding. And the moment you stop providing those inputs, they decline, they disappear, and the bed looks like it was never planted at all. The garden center wins that transaction twice. Once when you buy the plant, and again when you replace it. What nobody behind that counter will tell you is that an entire category of perennial plants operates on exactly the opposite logic. These are plants that get larger, denser, more structurally impressive, and more ecologically productive every single season without any intervention from the gardener. 11 of them are on this list, every one available in American retail. Not one will be recommended by someone whose job depends on you coming back to the store before plant number 1. Plant number 6 on this list produces a root system so extensive that researchers measuring it in undisturbed prairie soil stopped at 8 feet of vertical depth because their equipment ran out of range. It has been documented surviving consecutive seasons of summer drought that killed every other plant in the surrounding area without irrigation, without amendment, and without any human intervention whatsoever. It costs under $6 at most independent garden centers and will be in the perennial section with no label explaining any of this. That plant is coming. Stay for it. If this channel is not in the subscription feed, fix that right now. YouTube does not automatically show content from channels that viewers have not subscribed to. It delivers whatever generates the next click regardless of whether that content is useful or accurate. This channel releases specific biology-based, long-form perennial content every 2 days. Content built on documented plant science rather than retail talking points. Hit subscribe before going any further, and drop a U.S. state or USDA zone in the comments before plant number 1. That zone information is going to determine which of these 11 plants delivers the most return in the specific region being gardened. Plant 1. Peony, Paeonia lactiflora, and the century root system. Peony is the most chronically underestimated perennial in American horticulture. It arrives as a small root division, with 1 or 2 eyes, and produces a modest first season. Plant that gives no indication of what it is becoming underground. A root system that will sustain bloom production without any supplemental care for decades. Not years, decades. There are documented peony plantings in American gardens in continuous bloom production for over 100 years without division, without replanting, and without fertilization. The biology driving this longevity is in the peony's tuberous root architecture. Paeonia lactiflora develops thick, fleshy storage roots that accumulate carbohydrate reserves across the growing season and use those reserves to fund the following spring's growth and bloom without drawing on soil nutrients. The roots expand in diameter and number every season. A 3-year-old produces more blooms than a 2-year-old, a 5-year-old more than a 3-year-old. A 10-year-old peony in undisturbed soil has been compounding its underground infrastructure for a decade, and the bloom production reflects that accumulation in a way that no annual or short-lived perennial can. Approach peoniflorin and peonol, phenolic compounds, concentrated in peony root tissue, provide documented antimicrobial activity against the soil fungal species that attack fleshy roots in moist conditions. This biochemical self-defense explains why peony root systems persist in the same location for a century without the pathogen load that accumulates around less chemically defended root systems. Plant in USDA most of the country in full sun to partial shade. The single most critical placement rule: plant the eyes no more than 1 to 2 inches below the finished soil surface. Eyes planted deeper produce foliage, but no flowers indefinitely until the error is corrected. Plant 2. Baptisia, Baptisia australis, and the prairie. Permanence. Baptisia australis spends its first 2 growing seasons looking like very little is happening, and this apparent modesty is the reason it is consistently overlooked by gardeners who want visible results in the first season. The gardener who understands what is actually happening below ground during those 2 seasons, the root development, that is the entire point of those 2 years, will never make the mistake of giving up on. Baptisia before it matures. And the gardener who reaches year 3 and witnesses the transformation that Baptisia's mature root system produces above ground will never make the mistake of planting anything else in that location. Baptisia is a nitrogen-fixing legume. It hosts rhizobium bacteria in root nodules that convert atmospheric nitrogen into plant-available ammonium compounds, simultaneously building its own fertility and contributing to the surrounding soil. But the more consequential biology is the root depth. Baptisia develops a root system measured at depths exceeding 5 feet in undisturbed prairie soil, reaching stable moisture reserves that summer drought never touches. A mature Baptisia is drawing on resources no other plant in the border can access, which is why it stays vigorous through conditions that visibly stress its neighbors. By year 3, Baptisia reaches 3 to 4 feet in height and equal width, a rounded, shrub-like architectural form requiring no staking or pruning. In May, it covers itself in indigo blue pea-like flowers, followed by inflated gray-green seed pods that turn charcoal black in fall. Cytosine and related quinolizidine alkaloids in Baptisia foliage make it unpalatable to deer and rabbits. Plant in USDA most of the continental U.S. in full sun to light shade in average to lean soil. Do not amend heavily, and do not move it after year 2. The root system that makes Baptisia extraordinary makes it effectively immovable without destroying the plant entirely. Plant 3. Coneflower. Echinacea purpurea and the self-seeding colony Echinacea. Purpurea is the perennial that takes care of its own succession planning, producing the seeds, dispersing them within the existing planting, and filling gaps in the colony without any human involvement in the process. Most gardeners deadhead their coneflowers reflexively, removing spent flower heads because the cultural norm in American gardening is to keep beds tidy through the entire season. That reflexive tidiness is eliminating the self-seeding mechanism that makes Echinacea a plant that gets bigger and more productive every year it is. Allowed to operate on its own terms, the taproot of Echinacea purpurea drives 18 to 24 inches into the soil in its first 2 seasons and keeps deepening, accessing stable moisture below the surface drought zone. The alkylamide compounds concentrated in its root tissue, the same bioactives behind its medicinal reputation, function as osmotic regulators that maintain cellular water potential during drought. This is not passive drought tolerance. It is an active biochemical response that keeps root cells functional under conditions that permanently damage less sophisticated root systems. When seed heads are left standing, 2 things happen simultaneously. Seeds disperse into surrounding soil, creating new seedlings that fill gaps and expand the colony without any replanting effort, and the dried stems provide overwintering habitat for native bees and beneficial insects whose larvae control aphid and caterpillar populations the following spring. In USDA, most of the continental U.S. plant in full sun to part shade in average well-drained soil. Do not divide unnecessarily. Leave seed heads standing through winter. Cut back in late February as new basal growth becomes visible. Plant 4. Astilbe exerense, and the shade colony. Builder Astilbe is one of the very few perennials that performs the colony building, year-over-year expansion behavior, characteristic of the best low-maintenance perennials in a location that most others cannot occupy at all. The consistently moist, partially to fully shaded zone that exists in most American residential landscapes, and that generates more maintenance frustration per square foot than any other garden condition. Bare soil in moist shade grows weeds faster than any other situation in the residential landscape. Mulch in moist shade disappears into the soil within weeks. Annual impatience, the default solution, requires replanting every season and produces nothing of structural value. Astilbe, by contrast, expands by rhizome every season, fills the moist shade zone with increasing density every year, and produces feathery plumes of pink, red, white, or purple flowers in June and July that are among the most architecturally distinctive bloom structures Available in the perennial palette, the rhizome system that makes us still be better every year extends horizontally, stems outward from the central crown each season, producing new growth points that root into surrounding soil. Each new point becomes a new flowering crown the following season. In its first season, a single plant produces 1 or 2 plumes. In its third, 6 to 12. In its fifth, enough to read as a significant garden feature rather than an individual specimen. The plant is building its own infrastructure year by year. A stilb's shade adaptation operates at the chloroplast level. Shade-adapted cells produce more chlorophyll per unit of leaf area and orient larger chloroplasts to maximize light capture at low angles. The result is active, productive photosynthesis in conditions where sun-adapted plants operate at significant deficit. In USDA, most of the country plant in partial to full shade in consistently moist, organically rich soil. It does not tolerate drought, but in moist shade, it requires nothing beyond the existing moisture to produce decades of expanding performance. Plant 5, Russian Sage, Borovskia atriplicifolia, and the Silver Architecture, Russian. Sage arrives at the garden center every spring with a tag that says drought tolerant, and nothing else that explains what it is. What the tag will never say. It develops a root system driving 3 to 5 feet into the soil within 2 to 3 seasons, builds a woody crown that accumulates structural mass every year it remains in place, and produces aromatic volatile compounds that simultaneously repel certain pest species and attract the predatory insects that control others. A pest management system, a drought management system, and a structural anchor that gets more impressive every year. For under $5, the volatile compounds responsible for Russian sage's aromatic character, primarily rosmarinic acid, salviol, and various monoterpene derivatives, are produced in glandular trichomes covering every leaf and stem surface. These compounds serve a specific ecological function. They disrupt the olfactory navigation of pest insects, including aphids, thrips, and certain moth species that locate host plants by following the specific volatile profiles those plants emit. A Russian sage plant positioned at the windward perimeter of a vegetable bed or ornamental border functions as a chemical interference layer that redirects these insects before they locate the plants being protected. The silver-gray coloration of Russian sage foliage is not pigmentation but the visual effect of the dense trichome layer itself, a radiation-reflecting surface that reduces leaf temperature and slows transpiration, contributing to the plant's ability to maintain active growth. Through heat events that stress green-leaved neighbors, the woody crown Russian sage builds over successive seasons is the structural feature that makes it genuinely better every year, adding to the previous year's framework rather than rebuilding from ground level. By year 5, it has a shrub-like presence that first-year plants cannot approach. Plant in full sun in well-drained soil. Do not cut to the ground in fall. The woody crown needs its stems for winter protection. Cut back to 6 inches in late March as new growth emerges. After year 2, the plant requires nothing. Plant 6. Prairie drop seed, Sporobolus heterolepis, and the 8-foot root. This is the plant referenced at the opening of this video. Prairie drop seed, Sporobolus heterolepis, is the most structurally self-sufficient plant on this list and the one with the most documented evidence of genuine, measurable, independently verified performance under conditions that eliminate everything else. In prairie restoration research conducted across the American Midwest, prairie drop seed root systems have been excavated and measured at depths exceeding 8 feet in undisturbed soil, a root infrastructure so extensive that it accesses the permanent water table in most American soil profiles, eliminating drought as a meaningful stressor regardless of surface conditions. In the same research, prairie drop seed plots maintained active growth through consecutive drought seasons that caused complete above-ground dieback in every surrounding species. It was not dormant. It was not stressed. It was growing normally because it had spent its first 3 seasons building a water supply infrastructure below the drought zone entirely prairie. Dropseed is a C4 photosynthetic grass It uses a carbon fixation pathway, specifically adapted to operate at peak efficiency under high temperature and high light intensity, the exact conditions that suppress photosynthesis in most ornamental plants. When everything else in the garden is shutting down in August heat, prairie dropseed is at its metabolic peak. This is not heat tolerance. It is heat preference. Mature prairie dropseed reaches 18 to 24 inches as an arching, fine-textured fountain of foliage, achieving design potential in year 3 and continuing to improve beyond that. Late summer seed panicles are translucent in backlight and fragrant, a scent described as buttered popcorn or coriander. Autumn foliage turns gold and persists into winter. Across the northern two-thirds of the country, plant in full sun and lean, well-drained soil. Do not amend. Do not irrigate after establishment. The first 2 seasons build the root system. Year 3 is the reward. If you are in your 50s or 60s and the garden has started to feel like it demands more than it gives back, more labor per season, more replacement purchases, more weekends spent managing things that should be managing themselves, this channel exists specifically for the stage of gardening you're in right now. Not for beginners planting their first perennial. For gardeners who have put in the years and deserve plants that have also put in the years and show it. Drop a U.S. state and USDA zone in the comments right now. The gardener in the same zone, with the same conditions. Reading those comments is the most useful resource available for the specific decisions that determine whether a garden compounds in quality over time or keeps requiring the same inputs indefinitely. Plant 7, Hellebore, Helleborus X, Hybridus, and the winter bloom. Anomaly hellebore is the plant that does something no other commonly available perennial in American horticulture does. It blooms in winter, not in late winter, not at the edge of spring. In January and February in Zone 5 through the warm south, when the ground is frozen in most of the garden and the ornamental calendar is completely blank, hellebore is in active bloom, producing nodding flowers in colors ranging from near black through burgundy pink, white, and green that persist for 2 to 3 months because the cold temperatures that would accelerate the decline of spring blooms preserve hellebore's flower tissue in near-perfect condition. The ecological niche this occupies in a garden is irreplaceable by any other plant, and it deepens every year as the hellebore colony expands through self-seeding. Hellebore contains cardiac glycoside compounds, hellebrin, helleborin, and helleborane, concentrated throughout its foliage, stems, and roots. These compounds produce rapid gastrointestinal distress in any animal that browses the plant, which is why deer that encounter hellebore once avoid it permanently. In landscapes where deer pressure eliminates hostas, tulips, and most spring perennials, hellebore expands freely because nothing is eating it, allowing it to colonize shade garden soil at a rate that deer-sensitive plants cannot match. Hellebore self-seeds prolifically in Zone 5 through the warm south, producing seedlings that bloom in 2 to 3 years and exhibit genetic variation, each potentially a different flower color or spotting pattern. A 5-year colony allowed to self-seed freely produces a color range that no single purchase could replicate. The evergreen foliage persists year-round in the warmer half of the country. Plant in partial to full shade in organically rich, consistently moist, well-drained soil. Cut previous year's foliage to the ground in January, the only maintenance task required. Plant 8, Siberian iris. Iris sibirica and the no-division perennial most iris species require division every 3 to 4 years to maintain bloom production. The crowded rhizomes compete for life. Resources and flower output declines in the center of the clump, while the outer edges continue producing. This is the maintenance cycle that keeps most iris growers on a schedule of perpetual intervention. Siberian iris operates on different biology. Iris sibirica does not require division to maintain bloom production. The clump expands steadily at the margins, while the center remains productive. And the plant blooms reliably every season without the rhizome competition that necessitates intervention in bearded iris and other species. Leaving a Siberian iris in place is not just acceptable, It is the correct cultural practice that produces the best performance. The root system of Iris sibirica is fibrous rather than rhizomatous, a dense, interlocking mat of fine roots that increases in mass and extent every season without the central depletion that characterizes the rhizomatous species. This root architecture makes the plant highly tolerant of wet conditions, including periodic flooding that would rot bearded iris rhizomes within days. In rain gardens, at pond margins, in chronically moist, low spots that drain slowly after heavy rainfall, Iris sibirica not only tolerates these conditions, but performs at its best in them, producing the largest and most numerous flowers in consistently moist soil. The combination of wet soil tolerance, no division requirement, and expanding clump behavior makes it the ideal perennial for the moisture accumulation zones in residential landscapes that are otherwise difficult to plant successfully. Isoflavone compounds in Siberian iris root tissue produce mild allelopathic effects on weed seed, germination in surrounding soil, a chemical contribution to the physical weed suppression already provided by the dense root mat and closing leaf canopy. In USDA, most of the continental U.S. plant in full sun to partial shade in moist to wet soil, spaced at 18 to 24 inches. If division for propagation is desired, take it from the outer clump edge in early spring. If not desired, leave it entirely alone. Plant 9, Rudbeckia fulgida, and the self-managing prairie. Colony black-eyed Susan is the perennial that most American gardeners have grown as an annual, purchasing transplants, enjoying a season of bloom, and then watching the plant decline in subsequent years because it was never given the undisturbed soil time to build the root and rhizome architecture that makes it genuinely self-managing. In undisturbed soil over 3 to 4 seasons, Rudbeckia fulgida develops a rhizome network that spreads steadily outward from the initial planting, fills bare soil between established plants, and produces new flowering crowns every season without any intervention. The colony that results is denser, more floriferous, and more structurally complete every year. It is the opposite of the annual replacement cycle that most gardeners experience with Rudbeckia. The prairie origin of Rudbeckia fulgida is the key to understanding why disturbance, division, replanting, soil cultivation is the enemy of its best performance. Prairie plants evolved in an ecosystem of minimal soil disturbance. The deep, undisturbed soil of the American tallgrass and mixed grass prairies accumulated its root infrastructure over decades and centuries without being dug up, turned over, or replanted. The root systems of prairie origin perennials are calibrated to build depth and horizontal extent in stable, undisturbed soil conditions. Every time a Rudbeckia is divided and replanted, that root depth is reset to 0, and the plant spends the following 1 to 2 seasons rebuilding the infrastructure it already had. The colony that is never divided but simply allowed to expand into available soil accumulates root depth and rhizome extent that produces drought resistance, competitive vigor against weeds, and bloom production that first year and divided. Plants cannot match quercetin, and routine derivatives in Rudbeckia foliage serve as ultraviolet-absorbing pigments that protect leaf cells from photodamage in full sun, the biochemical basis of its heat tolerance. The same flavonoid compounds have documented anti-feedant properties against aphids and soft-bodied insects. Plant in full sun in average soil. Water during establishment, then stop. Do not divide in the first 3 seasons. Leave seed heads standing through winter. Cut back in March. Plant 10 catmint, Nepeta X. Fossinae and the 3-season performer catmint earns its position on this list through a combination of properties that individually would make it a good garden. Plant and together make it one of the most productive and self-sufficient perennials available in American horticulture. It blooms from late spring through early summer, responds to cutback by producing a second bloom period in midsummer, and often generates a third flush in early fall, covering more of the gardening calendar with active bloom than most perennials that produce a single-season display. It spreads steadily by crown expansion without becoming invasive. It requires no division to maintain performance, and the nepentolactone it produces in glandular trichomes on every leaf and stem surface functions as a documented repellent for mosquitoes, aphids, and several other pest species that make gardens less pleasant and less productive. The nepentolactone in catmint foliage has been demonstrated in peer-reviewed research to be approximately 10 times more effective as a mosquito repellent than DEET at equivalent concentrations. For the garden, a catmint planting at the perimeter of an outdoor living area is producing a passive chemical deterrent to mosquitoes and aphids continuously through the growing season without any intervention. It operates through the ambient volatile output of the plant. As it grows, the woody crown catmint builds over successive seasons, provides winter protection for growing points, and increases in structural substance every year. Walker's Low reaches 18 to 24 inches in height and 24 to 36 inches in spread, a mounding habit requiring no staking. In USDA, most of the country plant in full sun in well-drained soil. Cut back by 1/3 after each bloom flush, the only intervention required. After 3 seasons, the woody crown produces drought capability through normal summer dry periods. Plant 11. The nuclear option. Peonies X tree, Peony, Paeonia subfruticosa, and the permanent woody framework tree. Peony, Paeonia subfruticosa, is the most extreme example of a plant that improves with age available in American horticulture. The performance differential between a newly planted tree peony and a 20-year-old tree peony is so dramatic that they appear to be fundamentally different plants. They are the same plant at different stages of woody framework accumulation, a process that produces progressively larger, more structurally impressive, and more abundantly flowering specimens every year without any pruning, division, feeding, or management. Paeonia subfruticosa is a true woody shrub that retains and builds its woody framework every season. Stems that flowered this year persist through winter, produce new growth from their tips, and generate the following season's flower buds from that growth. A 10-year-old tree peony stands 4 to 5 feet tall, producing dozens of flowers on a decade of accumulated framework. A 20-year-old produces hundreds simultaneously. No annual plant and no other perennial produces a visual display at that scale from a single specimen. The flower of Paeonia subfruticosa is widely regarded as the most elaborate flower structure produced by any commonly available temperate garden plant. Individual blooms reach 6 to 12 inches in diameter in fully double forms, displaying layered petal arrangements of silk-like texture in colors that include pure white, cream, yellow, coral, pink, red, and near black purple, a color range wider than any other single genus in the ornamental plant world at this flower size. The fragrance of tree peony flowers is produced by a volatile compound profile that includes geraniol, linalool, and benzyl alcohol, the same aromatic compounds present in high-quality rose fragrances, at concentrations that make the flowers detectable from 10 to 15 feet away on still mornings. Tree peonies perform from Zone 4 through Zone 8 in full sun to light afternoon shade in deep, rich, well-drained soil. They do not tolerate waterlogged conditions or shallow soil over hardpan. Once planted correctly in the right location, do not move them, do not prune them, and do not expect dramatic performance in the first 2 to 3 seasons while the root system establishes. The patience required is real. The return on that patience is a permanent, self-managing, increasingly spectacular garden feature that will be blooming long after anything else in the garden has been replaced multiple times. 11 plants. 11 documented systems for a garden that demands progressively less and delivers progressively more. Every one available in American retail with no label that tells you what they are actually capable of.